Good afternoon, one and all. It's good to have you here. As my iPad just decided not to act in a helpful manner. Just a second. There we go. Welcome to Vanderbilt Divinity School and the 2016 Mafoi Carlisle Bogitsh Memorial Lecture. This lecture was established by a gift from Professor Emeritus Burton Bogitsh and his family in honor of Mafoi Bogitsh, who grew up as a Baptist in a small farming community in West Texas, where her mother, Una Hopper Carlisle, taught her the principle of religious tolerance. Mafoi studied comparative religion at Baylor University and cultivated a profound interest in various world religions and the cultures from which they arose. This interest grew when she married Burton, a man of Jewish heritage, and both involved themselves with the Unitarian tradition. It was within the religious philosophy of Unitarianism that Mafoi cultivated a deep understanding of the effect that cultural diversity has on religious beliefs. Through travel and exploration, Mafoi and Burton were privileged to learn about Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, and Islam in their native environs. The Mafoi Carlisle Bogitsh Memorial Lecture honors her lifelong interest in the interplay between culture and religious expression. This afternoon, we have members of the Bogitsh family who will wave their hands so you see where they are. And we encourage you to greet them as well as Anand afterwards when we have a small reception across the hallway in Tillet Lounge. This year's lecturer is Professor Anand V. Taneja, who is an assistant professor of religious studies with an emphasis in Islamic traditions of South Asia in the Department of Religious Studies, who's almost all right here, and at Vanderbilt. He has a BA with honors from the Department of History at Ramjas College, Delhi University, an MA in Film and Mass Communication from Jamia Millia Islamia, and a PhD from the Department of Anthropology of Columbia University. As a historically informed anthropologist, he focuses on religion and popular culture in urban South Asia by exploring how pre-colonial Islamic ethics and political theologies continue to inform shared religious practices, cultural forms, particularly Bombay cinema, and modes of relating to self and other in contemporary South Asia. He also probes how the textures of everyday life, including interactions with the state, altered experiences of temporality, and shifting ecologies have profoundly influenced popular theology. His current book project, Time, Islam, and Enchantment in the Medieval Ruins of Delhi, focuses on the ritual practices, dream lives, and modes of healing and sociality shared by Hindu and Muslim communities in contemporary Delhi's medieval ruins, where Islamic spirits known as jinn are venerated as saints. In this book, he explores how these theologically novel saint shrines emerge in a complex landscape of erasures and altered temporalities inaugurated by the partition of India and the mass ecological shifts and legal enchantments inaugurated by the post-colonial state, but also represent a continuing dialogue with this subaltern memory of Sufi ethics shared across conventional religious divides. The title of his lecture is Islamic Saints and Hindu Daughters, Kinship, Ethical Self-Fashioning, and Interreligious Relations at Feroz Shah Kotla Dargah, Delhi. Please join me in welcoming him from across the walkway to Vanderbilt Divinity School as this year's Bogitsh lecturer.
Thank you so much. It is a great honor to be asked to give the Bogitsh lecture at the Vanderbilt Divinity School, and I would like to thank Dean Towns for giving me this opportunity to speak with you. The focus of the Bogitsh lectures on cultural diversity and interfaith understanding is incredibly valuable at a time of increasingly polarized religious rhetoric worldwide, and especially in both the places I call home, the United States and India. I hope that my lecture here can give us a glimmering of other worlds that are still present and still possible. Today's talk is centered on Feroz Shah Kotla, a ruined medieval palace which has become a prominent Dargah, or Muslim saint shrine, in contemporary Delhi, the Indian capital, where I've spent several years doing fieldwork. Built circa 1354 by Sultan Feroz Shah Tughlaq and long fallen into disrepair, the widespread popularity of Feroz Shah Kotla as a Dargah began only in 1977. Feroz Shah Kotla is frequented by both Hindus and Muslims, and the saints venerated at this Dargah are not human by most accounts, but spirits known as jinn. This is highly unusual. Visitors write letters of petition to these jinn saints as if petitioning a government official, including their name, address, and passport photos in their appeals. They deposit multiple copies of these letters before makeshift altars in dark chambers within these ruins. Feroz Shah Kotla is also a place where animal life flourishes, especially cats, snakes, and kites. As the jinn are shapeshifters in Islamic mythology, often taking the form of animals, these animals are also imbued with sacrality in this space. There are no institutional religious figures at Feroz Shah Kotla. This is a historical monument under the custody of the Archaeological Survey of India, or ASI. It is an unusually democratic religious space characterized by freewheeling theological conversations, DIY rituals, and increasingly, selfies. Why is Feroz Shah Kotla important? Situated in the heart of the bustling capital of the largest democracy of the world, Feroz Shah Kotla casts new light on the relation of theology to post-colonial politics, the ethical potentialities that popular Islam holds open for Muslims and non-Muslims, and the relation of the ecological to urban sacrality. At a time when reformist Islam is dismissive of the jinn and the realm of the unseen, following the too familiar script of modernity and disenchantment, here we see the jinn being sanctified. The enchanted nature of popular Islam that we encounter here is not a pre-modern relic, but an ethical, political, and theological stance emerging anew in response to the post-colonial condition. In this talk, I want to highlight the second aspect of religious life that I work on: the ethical potentialities that popular Islam holds open for both Muslims and non-Muslims who come to Feroz Shah Kotla. Let me begin by talking about a self-identified daughter of one of the saints here, a person who I won't name in keeping with the customs of Feroz Shah Kotla. I will call her the lady from Lakshmi Nagar, as that is the part of the city that she came from, crossing the Yamuna River every Thursday afternoon to visit the shrine. The lady from Lakshmi Nagar was part of the circle of regulars, men and women, Hindu and Muslim, that I often sat with during my fieldwork at the shrine. The lady from Lakshmi Nagar was Hindu. Many of her friends here, including a person with whom both she and her husband had remarkably close bonds of affection and loyalty, were Muslim, as was the saint that she came here to pray to ask for his intercession with God. Prayer doesn't quite do justice to the relations of affection and intimacy that people share with the saints here. People most often refer to the jinn saints as Baba, a term with deeply paternal and affectionate resonances applied to holy men across the religious spectrum. Though the Baba is not just a different religion, but a different species from her, as it were, the lady from Lakshmi Nagar felt a deep, intimate personal connection with him. She sometimes picked up the sweets and flowers left as offerings for the Baba, something that, according to her, most others wouldn't dare to do because of her intimacy with the saint. Ye to hamare Baba ki hai, hum kha lenge, she said. This is my Baba's, I will eat it. Sometimes the Baba spoke as a voice inside her, playfully encouraging her to take the offerings made to him. She prized the things she had collected from his shrine, especially the markedly Islamic ones. Once, she declared during a conversation in the circle of regulars, she had found a silver Saudi Arabian coin at Feroz Shah Kotla, a gift from the Baba. The lady from Lakshmi Nagar attributed the birth of her children to the blessing of the Baba of Feroz Shah Kotla, 2 girls and 1 boy. In one conversation, the lady mentioned that she gave the offerings that she picked up from the shrine only to her daughters and not to her son. Because, after all, she said, the daughters were paraya dhan, another's wealth. Those sitting around in our circle nodded their heads in assent. So, to set the scene a little bit, in the middle of a 14th century ruin in the heart of modern Delhi, in the year 2010, a Hindu woman who claimed to have relations of daughterly intimacy and affection with a Muslim spirit saint said to a mixed gathering of Hindu and Muslim men and women that she gave the offerings made at the saint's shrine only to her daughters because they were paraya dhan, another's wealth. The logic of this statement was readily comprehensible to everyone but the anthropologist who sat in their midst. In unpacking the logic of the statement, as I will attempt to do in the rest of this talk, I hope to cast some light on what the relation of Muslim saints and Hindu daughters can tell us about kinship, ethical self-fashioning, and the role of Islam in the ethical life of North India across conventional religious divides. Relations between religions in South Asia have been seen as marked by either competition or syncretism. Is there another way of understanding interreligious interaction? Drawing on my research around this site, I offer another model, one of religions opening up new potentialities of ethical life and self-fashioning for the others they interact with, without either conversion or the dilution of doctrinal specificity. By offering us a model of Islam as an ethical inheritance as opposed to a religious identity, Feroz Shah Kotla forces us to rethink normative ideas of religion and the role of Islam in the ethical and religious life of North India. I focus here on the remaking of families and selves and the ways in which the enchanted traditions of Islam, often in opposition to modern authoritative Islamic discourse, contribute to these dynamics. Why do Hindus come to Muslim saint shrines? Let me begin to answer with an ethnographic anecdote. It was a Thursday afternoon, and I was at Feroz Shah Kotla as usual, hanging out, when all of a sudden there was a current of excitement. A group of 20 Western tourists had walked in and were looking around. This was a pretty rare event for Kotla, as tourists, especially Western ones, hardly ever came here, unlike at the better-known historical monuments of Delhi, and certainly not in a group this large. It turned out that there were a group of art history students from Northwestern University. While we were talking, another man who speaks a little English also joined us and introduced himself to the art historians. Myself, Ashik Ali, he said. When the art historians had left, one of the other regulars turned to Ashik Ali and said, "I've known you for 15 years now, but you never told me your name before." This was a moment of epiphany for me, when something I had noticed but not yet consciously put my finger on came sharply into focus. People seldom use names at Feroz Shah Kotla. It was the kind of space where it was quite possible to meet someone every week for 15 or 20 years, have long conversations about politics and theology and personal ailments, pray for relief from each other's sufferings or curse each other out, and never know the other person's name. At most, people use descriptive nicknames or regional epithets like Kasabpure wale or Lakshmi Nagar wale, from Kasabpura or from Lakshmi Nagar. But even those were most often used as references when the person mentioned was not present. Till he introduced himself to the art historians, I had not known what Ashik Ali's name was, even though we had spoken to each other a few times. I should say that this is pretty unusual. When I was growing up in North India, it was not uncommon for complete strangers to ask you on first meeting, not just your name, but also what your caste was. I began to think of this ethics of nameless intimacy at Feroz Shah Kotla as characteristic of Gharib Nawazi, the culture of hospitality to the stranger, which I believe accounts for the healing and transformative power of dargahs. Gharib Nawaz is, of course, the popular honorific of the Sufi saint Muinuddin Chishti, the founder of the Chishtiya Sufi lineage in India, whose dargah is the most popular one in the Indian subcontinent. I started thinking about the phrase Gharib Nawaz because so many people at Feroz Shah Kotla, across communities, were talking about going to the Dargah of Gharib Nawaz in Ajmer. At the time, the song Khwaja Mere Khwaja from the recent movie Jodha Akbar, with its opening invocation Ya Gharib Nawaz, kept playing on the radio and the TV, forming an integral part of the soundscape. Tradition travels through strange routes. What does it mean to come to the door of those who are Gharib Nawaz, hospitable to strangers? In India, names easily identify one's religious community and caste. The anonymity of everyday interaction at Feroz Shah Kotla, on the other hand, allows for the possibilities of a kinship that transcends the usual boundaries of family and community. Here, people's intimacy is premised on them being strangers to one another. One time, when we were all sitting around in the lawns at Feroz Shah Kotla, one of the regulars, who was Hindu, said that 75% of the people who come to dargahs are Hindus. Everyone nodded their heads in agreement, including the Muslims present. Then he said that the people who go most to dargahs are people from Pehlwan's Qaum, community or caste. Everyone nodded in agreement again. It is reflective of the ethics of nameless intimacy that Pehlwan's Qaum was never explicitly mentioned. Pehlwan, a nickname which means wrestler, his real name is known but never used, is from the Balmiki caste. In other words, he's from the Bhangi or sweeper caste, former untouchables, whose traditional work was cleaning the streets and drains and carrying away the shit of the city. This is not something that anyone else at Feroz Shah Kotla ever mentioned to me, and not something that you could tell from observing the dynamics of our group, where he had a reputation as a person of unusual wisdom and kindness. Pehlwan told me himself several months into my research after we had become good friends. The Saint Shrine is the place of nameless hospitality, opening up the possibility of becoming estranged from one's social identity, becoming something other than the role expected of you in a hierarchically ordered society and a patriarchal familial order. Women, for example, freely express their disaffection with the often oppressive structures of their natal and marital families in this space. The ability to form communities of hamdardi, shared pain or empathy, while stepping out of one's socially determined identity is, I believe, a major factor in the healing power of Muslim saint shrines such as Feroz Shah Kotla. Conventional understandings of morality emphasize the adherence to social norms and authoritative traditions as being primarily constitutive of morality. But such understandings of both morality and tradition leave no room for understanding ethical articulations of the self that are opposed to dominant social mores. At Feroz Shah Kotla, I came across countless individual challenges to the hierarchical order and patriarchal norms that are the dominant understandings of Indian culture today, as articulated by Hindu upper caste male speakers, norms which are often enforced by both familial violence and by the violence of the mob. Many of these challenges come from women, both Hindu and Muslim. Feroz Shah Kotla seems like a unique space, particularly for the women who come here, in the midst of the oppression and gendered violence that increasingly mark Delhi and other Indian cities. Here, I share the stories of two women that I encountered at Feroz Shah Kotla. On a cold winter dusk, early in my fieldwork, I sat alone with a woman, listening to her story of desire, love, and loss. She and I had both been speaking with Balung, the unofficial caretaker of one of the alcoves associated with the saintly jinn, who usually lingered on at Feroz Shah Kotla for a while after the daytime crowds had dispersed. The woman was a widow. Her husband had been dead 10 months. She had started coming to Feroz Shah Kotla after his death. The woman asked Balon to make a wish for her, and Balon laughingly said, "You're already much better than you were 10 months ago. Be happy." Then Balon got up and left, leaving us alone. Tusi Punjabi ho? She asked me if I was Punjabi in Punjabi, noticing the iron bracelet that I was wearing. When I answered in the affirmative, she showed me her own iron bracelet nestled amongst her bangles. Her whole family was in Punjab, she said, and she started talking to me about her life. She came from New Seelampur across the river. She did not have any children, but she had been pregnant once and miscarried at 5 months. I got late today, she said, because I always come here after a bath. And I was heating the water today when a friend from the neighborhood came by. The friend said, "Why don't you get married again? I have a boy in mind." But she said, "I told my friend that I didn't want to get married. This is the way the world is. If I get married and leave everything, what if he leaves me? If I'm destined to meet someone, I will crash into him. Takra jaungi. If my fate was good, then I wouldn't have lost my husband. He was a Muslim, but he never stopped me from doing anything. I would go to the goddess shrine of Vaishnav temple inside the house, but he never stopped me. Where will I find a man like him? When I was 14 years old, I came here from Punjab and stayed with my aunt, my mother's sister, and that's when I met him. I told my family I'm not marrying unless I marry him. He was so good looking, I was not any less. Main bhi koi kam nahi thi." She looked directly at me as she spoke, and we weren't that far apart in age. She must have been in her mid-30s then. The strangest thing about that evening is not her story, which was uncommon. A Hindu girl moving from Punjab to Delhi and then marrying a Muslim, cutting off all ties with her family, and integrating into the landscape of New Seelampur, a predominantly Muslim working class settlement. The strangest thing that evening was the very fact of our conversation. This is not how men and women are supposed to interact with each other in public spaces in Delhi, a city with an increasingly terrible reputation for violence against women. Outside of zones of relative egalitarianism and the free mingling of sexes, such as college campuses and modern consumer spaces like shopping malls, Delhi is a hostile place for unaccompanied women in public. The presence of men overwhelmingly dominates the cityscape, including sidewalks and public transport. Women negotiate this masculine landscape at their own peril, constantly facing the threat of sexual harassment or worse. Outside of fleeting commercial transactions, most women in Delhi are wary of speaking to strange men. And yet, at Feroz Shah Kotla, women talk to men all the time. They talk about lost love and the power of desire. He was so good looking, I was not any less. They talk about matters spiritual and theological, and in public debates, they have no compunctions in telling men that they are wrong or misguided. They crack jokes with men, and within the space, the men treat them as friends, confidants, teachers, as equals and superiors. The dislocations wrought by the sweeping changes to the society, economy, and landscape of Delhi in recent years has added a sharper, more brutal edge to the misogynistic violence stemming from traditional patriarchal norms. Encounters like the one described above, where women share intimate details of their lives of desire with men who are essentially strangers, are not supposed to happen, certainly not across the boundaries of caste, class, and religion, as so often occurs at Feroz Shah Kotla. Why is it that a space associated with Islam, a religion associated with a highly patriarchal order, as symbolized by the wailing of women, becomes a space where women can be much freer and more open in interacting with men and in talking about their desires than they can be in most public spaces in Delhi? To try and answer that question, let me begin by reading an extract from a letter deposited at Feroz Shah Kotla. Hundreds of letters are deposited every week in the dark alcoves and underground chambers of Feroz Shah Kotla. These letters are petitions addressed to the saints. I have photographed about 100 of these letters in situ. Here is the text of one such letter. "Baba, I am very troubled by my family and their behavior. You must know about me. No one understands me at home. Everyone thinks of themselves. Why am I the only one who's concerned about this home? And even though I'm the only one who's concerned, I always hear the worst for it. I'm always upset by my brother and my mother. These people of my family have made me into what I am today, what I could not even think of being in my dreams. Baba, I had thought, if not my family, then at least the one I care for, the one I love, would be mine. But even in this, fate has not supported me. I love that boy so much. I think about him. I want to marry him. But he says that I won't be able to marry you. When I asked him the reason, he said that my father is no longer in this world, and now I am the eldest in the family. I cannot marry like this. I know everything about him, but still I cannot leave him. Now only you can set him right and show him the right way. I will always stay in your shadow. The letter writer turns to the Baba, one of the jinn saints of Feroz Shah Kotla, because her family does not support or understand her, and the man she loves cannot marry her because of his obligations to his family. From the names, it is clear that she is Muslim and he is Hindu, and this may be the reason he does not want to marry her, as it will upset the family. She turns to the Baba for relief from both their families and asks the Baba to convince her lover to marry her against the presumed wishes of his family, against the normative morality of community, where marriages across religious communities are increasingly frowned upon and acted against. Already, the letter seems like a relic from another age, in a time when the resurgent Hindu right wing has been whipping up hysteria against what they call love jihad, an imaginary covert campaign in which Muslim men are seducing Hindu women to increase the Muslim population. I wonder what the Hindu right, with its naked anxieties about maintaining patriarchal control over female bodies and reproduction, will make of the letters written at Feroz Shah Kotla, in which time and time again the wishes made at the Dargah upset the apple cart of the Hindu undivided family. The Hindu undivided family is a legal term which treats the joint family as a unit for taxation and investment purposes. The concept of the Hindu undivided family is based on the patrilocal joint family system, still prevalent in much of India across religious communities, in which married couples reside with the husband's parents and daughters go away to stay in their husband's homes with their sasural, the husband's extended family. This is why the lady from Lakshmi Nagar called her daughters Paraya Dhan, another's wealth and not her own, destined to be given away in marriage to another family, while her son and his future bride would stay with her. By being brought under the purview of the state and its affairs, this traditional category of familial arrangement has become normative through state sanction, displacing and delegitimizing other forms of family and familiarity, such as the worlds of independent desiring women we glimpse in 18th century Rekhti poetry, about which I'll talk in a little while. But in the letters written by women at Feroz Shah Kotla, the extended family is the site of suffering, where the daughter or daughter-in-law or wife is misunderstood, and where there is always suspicion or ill will harbored against her and her husband and children. In a letter at Feroz Shah Kotla that Ummida writes, first she gives an extraordinarily detailed list of her sasural, her marital home, and all its inhabitants. Her parents-in-law, her two jates, her husband's elder brothers, her two jethanis, the wives of the elder brothers, her devranis, husband's younger brother's wives, and her devars, husband's younger brothers. Please pray, Baba, that whoever among them has thought or done ill, either about Ummida or Ummida's husband Habib, or about Habib's work, or about Ummida's children and their studies, in whatever way, may the bad thing happen to them instead, and may it be so bad that they land up in bed and pass the life of the sick for a year or two, and pray that Habib's work goes well, and a voice enters his ears, and he sells the house in Hapur and buys one in Ghaziabad and starts staying in Ghaziabad forever. Just Habib, Ummida, and their children, and no one else comes with them. Not the father-in-law, the mother-in-law, not Devrani, not Jethani, not the husband, sister, and her husband. No one else. Rather than seeking a reintegration into the family, as the extant literature on the healing practices of Indian shrines would suggest, these letters suggest a flight from the joint family, the forming of a romantic couple separated from the domain and demand of the extended family. Is it that life in modern Delhi, hypermediated by images from television and Bollywood, has changed people's ideas of the self and intimacy and their obligations to the family? I argue the opposite. It is families and caste communities that have been empowered in colonial and post-colonial India at the expense of individual freedom to regulate the body and sexuality of individuals through the codification of custom. In contrast, the popular veneration of Muslim jinn saints, going back to at least the 18th century, has enabled both the expression of non-normative desire and the remaking of the self in ways that challenge the dominant moralities of family and community. I find evidence for this in pre-modern Rekhti poetry, especially in the divan or collected poetry of the poet Saadat Yar Khan Rangeen, a mercenary, a horse trader, and a poet who lived and worked and traveled extensively in late Mughal India. He could also be said to be the first ethnographer poet. He claims to have spent a lot of time with courtesans and with married women, and he gave the name Rekhti to a genre of poetry that purports to be women's speech, and which Rangeen claims is ethnographic documentation of women's speech, rituals, beliefs, emotions, and sexual practices. The Divan includes a glossary of women's words to help his readership, as these words indexed cosmologies, rituals, and concepts that would have been unknown to the elite men of his time. The glossary gives a list of male and female spirits venerated by women. The female jinn in this list are known as paris or fairies. Sheikh Saddu Mia Zain Khan, Mia Sadre Jahan, Pir Hatile, Nanhe Mia, Chahal Tan, Mia Shah Darya, Shah Sikandar, the 7 fairies, that is red fairy, green fairy, yellow fairy, black fairy, river fairy, sky fairy, light fairy. They believe in all of them and know them to be their guides and helpers. But in the case of Mia Shah Darya, Shah Sikandar, and the 7 fairies, they say that they are all brothers and sisters and that God sent them from heaven to be playmates of Fatima, the Prophet Muhammad's daughter, and that they should serve her. They are her slaves, and for this reason, they consider them preeminent. The majority of them even call Mia Shah Darya and Shah Sikandar the princes of light, Nuri Shahzade. Intimacy with the fairies and the princes of light had different kinds of affective significance for the women who claimed intimacy with them, if we follow Rangeen's Diwan. Intimacy with the female fairies indexed being enraptured by physical beauty. Intimacy with the male princes of light offered escape and refuge from the claustrophobic world of the extended family. ज़बां तो एक है किस किस का मैं करूं शिकवा, इधर तो सास का दुख है और उधर है ननद का गम. I have one tongue, who all should I complain about? Here there's the sorrow of my mother-in-law, and there the grief of my sister-in-law. गजब ये है कि मेरी बैठकर कनौती में बाहम ये मिलके किया करतियां हैं मुझ पे सितम. What really angers me is that all of them conspire, sitting behind my back and heap tortures upon me. निकालूं किसके आगे तेरे सिवा जी का बुखार, मेरा है छूट तेरे हमराज ना कोई महरम. Apart from you, who can I disclose the fever of my soul to? Apart from you, I have no intimate, no confidant. At Feroz Shah Kotla, as in Rangeen's poem, the figure of the Baba serves as the confidant to whom things are said and written that cannot be uttered elsewhere. The jinn or Baba, as in the poem, continues to offer a space of refuge and protection from the obligations and claustrophobia, the rivalries and jealousies of family life. As Rekhti poetry shows, there is a fairly long tradition of seeing the extended family not just as fundamentally constitutive of the self, as many theorists of Indic personhood have argued, but also as a space of abuse and dishonor, a space from which one seeks refuge. As Hindi films often show, it is the Dargah, the Muslim saint shrine, that individuals and couples turn to seek refuge from their families. Bombay cinema has long been recognized as Islamicate, or characterized by Muslimness, so the major popular cultural form of contemporary India stands in a little bit of tension with the idea of India as a Hindu nation, an idea central to the ideology of India's current Hindu majoritarian government. Lovers rebelling against the family are a stock in trade for Bombay or Bollywood films. Rather than just offering its spectators a modern metropolitan view of love and subjectivity, as has been argued, Bombay cinema also draws on pre-modern traditions of asserting individual desire, and hence freedom, against the dominant morality of family and community. The example of cinematic rebellion I want to show you now is not from a Bollywood film, however, but from an Indo-Canadian production set in Delhi. In the scene that I'll just show, two Hindu women come to the Dargah of the Saint Chirag Dilli in Delhi. They are sisters-in-law, both married to brothers who live together in a joint family, both suffering from spousal neglect. They fall in love with each other, but secretly, within the confines of their marriages and their shared marital home. It is only at the shrine of the Muslim saint that a more radical wish can be uttered. Let's leave the family, the younger woman says to the older, after making a wish that they can be together forever. And here,
let's leave. See, Jatin has Julie, Ashok Bhaiya is Swamiji, and VGL no. They won't even miss us. And how will we survive? We'll start on take away at first.
the above scene was from Fire, a film by the Indo-Canadian filmmaker Meera Nair, the 1998 Indian release of which generated an immense amount of controversy and violence by Hindu right-wing activists. In the reasons given by the leadership of the Hindu right-wing party, the Shiv Sena, members of which spearheaded the violent protests and attacks against the film, it was the film's threat to the patriarchal family order which justified their attacks and a call for a ban on the film. The fear was expressed that films like this would spoil women and encourage them to leave their husbands and families. What remained little commented upon in all the controversy, political and academic, that followed the release of Fire and its violent reception in India was the small but crucial role that the Dargah played in the film. Perhaps it passed unheeded because the Dargah as a site of the blessing of transgressive desire is so ubiquitous in Indian film and television, as it is in quotidian life, that it doesn't merit comment. But the paradox that this ubiquity raises is a profound one. If Islam, as represented by its normative jurisprudential traditions, aka the Sharia, is understood as patriarchal, why do spaces identified as Muslim become the places, in cinema and in everyday life, where wishes can be uttered by women that upset patriarchal orders of family and community? Women far outnumber men in the congregation at Feroz Shah Kotla, and women, like the lady from Lakshmi Nagar, often express a deep intimacy with the saints here. The men who come to Feroz Shah Kotla often started coming here to pray for girl children, which seems anomalous in a city where the child sex ratio stood at 866 girls to 1,000 boys in the 2011 census, in part because of the selective abortion of female fetuses. The Jinn saints of Feroz Shah Kotla are anti-patriarchal father figures, perceived as the indulgent fathers of daughters and not of sons. In patrilocal and patriarchal North Indic culture, the Babul, the father of the daughter destined to go away to another, is a figure of unconditional childhood affection and intimacy. To articulate desires that contradict the normative morality of family and society, women, Hindu and Muslim, and the men who love them, come to pray to and petition the jinn saints at Feroz Shah Kotla, perceived as father figures of daughters. Apart from you, who can I disclose the fever of my soul to? Apart from you, I have no intimate, no confidant. What makes Muslim saints become such anti-patriarchal figures for women and men across religious divides when the image of Islam in the contemporary mediascape is so thoroughly oppressive of women? If I've asked several variants of the same question several times already in this talk, this is because even in the scholarly literature, the emphasis on the authoritative nature of the discursive tradition of Islam narrows the possibilities of human freedom for women within this tradition. Yet, the women who come to Feroz Shah Kotla express their longings, their desires, and their defiance of the norms of family and community in a space sanctified by the presence of Muslim saints. These articulations and their interactions with strangers, men and women, serve as the beginning of a process of sanctified estrangement and a remaking of the self towards open and unforeseen futures. And not just at Feroz Shah Kotla, for women visit Muslim saint shrines throughout the Islamic world. What is encountered at saint shrines, I believe, is an ambiguity inherent to Islam, the anti-patriarchal potential that is as much a part of the Islamic tradition as the patriarchal jurisprudential traditions. For the figure of the Prophet Muhammad, as he comes down in popular traditions, embodies many, many traditionally feminine qualities such as modesty, humility, and gentleness. He is a figure whose life course is marked by his love, affection, and respect for the women in his life, as the feminist scholar Fatima Marnisi recounted in telling of her grandmother's and her own affective relations with the beloved Prophet. And as the work of Fatima Marnisi, Amna Wadud, and particularly that of Asma Barlas shows us, the Quran itself can be read as a remarkably anti-patriarchal text. In her analysis of the Quran's anti-patriarchal potential, Asma Barlas points out that in the Quranic narrative, Prophet Muhammad himself is never the symbolic father of the Muslim community. Quote, "From the denial of symbolic fatherhood to the Prophet, which exegetes pass over in silence, I derive the lesson that in Islam, God's rule displaces rule by the father. The Quran views fathers in a fundamentally different way than patriarchies do." Barlas also connects the anti-patriarchal potential of the Quran to the bias of the Prophet. Given that the Prophet is not sacralized as a father, I quote here again, is it also a mere coincidence that he loses his father, Abdullah, in his own infancy, and all his sons in theirs, that only his daughters survive at a time and in a place when people viewed girls as a curse? The Prophet is remembered as a loving father of a daughter, Fatima, and not of sons. He's remembered as a man who embodied feminine qualities and loved and respected women and often preferred them to men. And yet, he's also remembered as making misogynistic statements which come down to us in the corpus of sound hadiths or narratives of the Prophet's life that form the basis for dominant patriarchal readings of the Sharia. This is the ambiguity inherent in Islam, both the patriarchal readings of the law and the anti-patriarchal potential of the Quran and the life of the Prophet. The dominant academic understanding of the discursive tradition of Islam have focused on the former, but not on the latter. How does the anti-patriarchal potential of Islam get transmitted down the centuries? To understand this, we need to turn to the realm of the popular, to the ways in which myths and stories, dreams and images, songs and cinema both surpass and evade the contemporary authorized discourses of Islam and are yet also in constant conversations with them. In the dreams of Egyptian women, as Amira Mittermeier's work shows, the appearance of the Prophet as a figure of mercy often sanctions deviations from Sharia obligations. This seems to be such a recurring and widely occurring phenomenon that there is a scholarly consensus that regardless of what the Prophet says in a dream can never reverse any central religious tenets. Dreams still matter in Islam, as Mittermeier's work shows us, despite the modern reformist bias against prophetic evidential dreams. Fairies once mattered too, embodiments of the licit power of feminine beauty and desire connected to the memory of the Prophet's daughter. And at Muslim saint shrines, Shrines dedicated to figures mimetic of the Prophet, in that they try to emulate the spiritual states and ethical stances of the Prophet. Women outnumber men, recalling the Prophet's preference for women over men. Like the Prophet, the saints are seen as anti-patriarchal father figures, considered the fathers of daughters and not of sons. And so the food offered to Muslim saints is given not to sons, but to daughters. And because Muslim saint shrines are spaces hospitable to strangers, the daughters of the saints include both Hindus and Muslims. Given the blinkered views of Islam dominant in almost all forums in the West, and the equation in both academia and media of patriarchal readings of Islam being coterminous with all of Islam, it seems vitally important to assert that human freedom, the potentiality of ethical self-fashioning and owning one's desire, remains open as a potentiality within living Islamic traditions, and not just as a hermeneutic exercise returning to the Quranic text. Equally, if not more important, is simply to do justice to the world that my interlocutors at Feroz Shah Kotla so generously let me into. In this world, relations between religions were not characterized only by competition, winning converts, or syncretism, doctrinal dilution and mixing. In an idea that seems perhaps radical from Western academic perspectives, but commonsensical and ordinary to people at Feroz Shah Kotla, one religious tradition opens up ethical possibilities in the lives of those who identified with another. Islam opens up a set of ethical possibilities for the lives of those who come to Muslim saint shrines, irrespective of their religious affiliation. In conclusion, by positing Feroz Shah Kotla as a space of human freedom, I aim to show three things. In the North Indian context, we need to understand Islam not just as a religious identity, but as an ethical inheritance and a set of moral potentialities that crosses religious boundaries. Two, that the popular Islam encountered here is not folk or deviant Islam as opposed to the classical tradition, because it is deeply rooted in the originary sources of the tradition. And three, that our conceptions of ethical life are somewhat attenuated if we don't take on board some enchantment. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Anand. This is wonderful, wonderful presentation. I'm wondering about the genies, the jinn, who become these saintly intermediaries. I'm wondering where they come from. That is to say, not simply the category of jinn, because this is a long established, even Quranic category of creature, but these specific jinn, that is to say, where do they get their identity? Where do they get their character? Because they clearly seem to be this wonderful, dare we say, pantheon or divan of characters who are charming. I mean, they're going to form these relationships. So I'm wondering, because the whole genre, let's say, of hagiography, right, is about creating the character of a saintly figure or a wali.
Yes.
So this is a rich tradition, and I'm wondering this connection with the jinn.
Thanks. Thank you, Richard. That's a really good question, and I don't know if I can entirely do it justice. So, in terms of tracing a genealogy of the jinns back, which is why I go back to the Rekhti poetry in the 18th century, because that's kind of the first, the most extensive archive in a sense of that I've been able to find of what pre-modern relations to jinn look like. And this particular connection to to women and women's religious practices. Now, the kind of stuff that you see in Rekhti poetry and in the kinds of ways in which people talk about jinn here ties up with a whole kind of series of relationships that people have with jinn, which the anthropological literature is full of, all the way in the Sudan and in Morocco as well. That's where a lot of it's done. And and there's, a lot of that work is on possession and stuff, but not a lot of the work of that work thinks of the ethical work that this kind of jinn veneration or relations to jinn might do. And what I'm kind of pushing towards, and I don't really have answers yet, is that we might need to think of these jinns in terms of affects, right? The transmission of affect that doesn't necessarily, that is intersubjective and interpersonal, and by these jinns having these various names and various characteristics, it's an understanding of affects that come from outside you and move you, and kind of a sophisticated understanding of ethics, which are not just about what you decide to do with your life, but how you respond to the world around you. I guess that's what I'm trying to,
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, I love this idea of the jinn becoming sort of tools for important work to be done.
What about the ethics of making copies of those letters?
I have thought about that a lot, and I actually went into the place with a couple of my friends there who hang out, and I was like, "What do you think?" And they were like, "The ethics of this is because I feel like it's an archive." I have two ways of thinking about it. I think of this as an archive of everyday life and of women's voices in the city, which no one else is thinking about because these letters get swept away. So in a sense, by photographing those letters, I am getting access to women's voices, women's autobiographical writing in a sense that doesn't exist that otherwise will never make it into the public domain. And two, I use some names here, but I change names. And I make sure that there's nothing in my published work that can actually identify these people.
But do they want their desires to be, even if they're not identified as their desires, to be part of the public domain?
I think well, that's a tricky question, but the ways in which people talk about their desires at this site would make me think that under the cover, given that they, the ways in which namelessness allows them to speak about things that might otherwise be unspeakable, makes me feel a little bit better. I know that it is still ethically somewhat dubious terrain, but it makes me feel better about it. So.
Thank you. I guess I have a private public question too, and that is the difference, or if there's a difference, between having a private religion or a private wish and a more kind of organized religion and public faith. And clearly, the particular kind of intimacy that you describe at this one place is well, you say it's somewhat unique. There are other shrines where this also happens. But I'm trying to understand the relationship between the private wish and what seems to be a very personal, private form of religiosity or intimacy with one jinn, and how that works with what would be a more kind of, I guess, either public or identification as either Muslim or Hindu. Do these things work together in kind of complementary relation? Is this, to use a very personal example, like my very Catholic grandmother, praying to her Buddha, you know, which her Catholic Church would like totally not be okay with. So I'm just kind of curious what these private wishes do for someone's more kind of public religious identity.
I think that's a really good question, and I think that's where the ethics of anonymity at this space come in, right? Because people eventually figure out who you are because you are volunteering information about yourself, right? But in the beginning, and the ways in which people talk about the wishes they've had, and the ways in which, in this space, the Hindus have these really deep and intimate connections to Muslim saints seem to be unproblematic to them. So, and they talk about it in these gatherings. So already the relation between private and public is a little bit blurred there. And I think precisely because of this, I've been uncomfortable with thinking about it as religious and moving more towards the domain of thinking about this as ethics. So, yeah, sorry, that's a cop-out, but yeah.
I'm going to follow up since the microphone's
Yeah.
right next to me. I don't know if it was given to me as well, but thank you. That was a wonderful talk. And I really liked your story about the kind of anonymity and the intimacy of anonymity when people don't know the name despite. And you talked about the way that anonymous intimacy is, produces non-normative kinship, or you read it in those kind of terms. And I was curious about, what's at stake in still calling some of these relationships kinship rather than thinking of them as modes of sociality or intimacy that they're outside of kinship at all. So I'm thinking about maybe things like even friendship, or even thinking about intimacy outside. And I understand the sort of the critical dimension of that vis-a-vis standard normative kinship structures, but I'm curious how you came to still want to call it kinship and what's at stake there.
I'll give you a flippant answer to start with. I'm an anthropologist. Kinship is my bread and butter, right? But no, I think I'm interested in the term kinship, not in terms of the various forms of sociality that emerge at Feroz Shah Kotla, which obviously I think terms like friendship and other, even like names for intimacies we don't yet have, might be applicable for them. But I'm thinking of kinship specifically in the kind of relations that people assume with the saints, where there is this relation of, the saint is addressed as a kind of father figure, as paternal, but paternal without being patriarchal, which I find very, very interesting, right? This constant linkage, and it is a linkage of fictive kinship, of women to saints, and the saint being assumed as a kind of father figure. So that particular kind of fictive kinship, and the ways in which it goes against, the ways in which it fits into Indic family typologies, but also allows a very, very different kind of normativity, but challenges normativity, right? In that sense, challenges patriarchal normativity is what I find really productive. So, yeah.
Just have a short question. Could you expound on the love jihad slide that you had up?
Oh, yeah.
Where at the bottom it looked like some kind of cycle of love, deceit, marriage, and...
So, I just picked up this slide of all the things that you get when you Google love jihad, because, the aesthetics are particularly appalling. But love jihad is this idea, and it's completely fictitious, of this organized conspiracy by Muslim men to seduce Hindu women so that you're producing more Muslim children and less. It's this kind of bizarre right-wing fantasy which has gotten a lot of mileage since 2014, when the current government, which is Hindu right-wing in its ideological orientation, has come into power. So it's very similar to anti-Semitic rhetoric that was around in Nazi Germany in the 1930s and stuff like that. And yeah, so.
since, again, I'm sitting next to the person with the microphone. Maybe I can grab it. So I have a question about the possibilities of the ethical potentiality you describe at this site. Because it seems that the unusual interactions are perhaps in a space that are to some extent protected by jinn, and also perhaps consistent with the ethics of the jinn as people understand it. So I'm just wondering, if we might think about it spatially or in other ways. Do you imagine that this ethical potentiality can be extended outside of the Dargah?
Actually, that's a really good question. And my immediate kind of reaction is to say no, right? Because even people who would subscribe to the ethic of nameless intimacy inside the place, inside the walls of Feroz Shah Kotla, or inside other Dargah spaces, right? Because this is similar to them in that sense. As soon as they left, would start backbiting and saying, oh, that person, and like all the identity would come rushing back, and all the stereotypes and everything else. But people do carry this outside in the sense that they do form friendships which last outside the space. So it's not just that you just meet inside the space. Some of it does go outside, but the ways in which this kind of ethic leaves the space is also very interesting, right? A lot of it is happening through people's dreams. A lot of it is happening in not at the conscious registers, which are very dominated by religion as a category of identity now. So I think this coexists, but yeah, the very particular ways in which people interact with each other inside the space do tend to dissipate outside. So yeah. And there are questions at the back.
Thank you very much. I was really struck by the phrase that you used at the end of the talk about Feroz Shah Kotla being a space of human freedom. But I also noticed that earlier in the talk you mentioned about the importance of animals in the space.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could talk to the ways that this was distinctly a space of human freedom as opposed to some sort of interspecies freedom.
Thank you. Well, I guess I kept using the phrase human freedom because I'm trying to situate myself in the anthropological and hence focusing on the anthropos literature on ethics, right, which is interested in human freedom. But yeah, I think I didn't really talk about it here, but there is a lot of interspecies relations going on at Feroz Shah Kotla, which I think about in terms of what it is doing, given the fact that Delhi now is a city of 20 million human beings, and nature or ecology seem to be very distant from most people's experience, and yet here there's kind of this constant evocation of living with other animals, right? With living with birds and with bats and with snakes, and yeah, thank you for. So I think I should leave out the human freedom and talk about interspecies freedom in the future. Yeah.
I had a question about the space itself and whether the sort of architectural or archaeological specificity of that particular site is important in sort of its constitution, of how it's working for people. And I mean, that's obviously also a question about other sites like this.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, and I'm just going to show you a slide. So actually, it's important. So look at this slide, I guess, which is a Bombay film set from the 1970s. These beautiful cusped arches. And then look at this slide, and actually, Amira Mittermeier's book cover too, which is in this beautiful mosque in Cairo. So I think there is a way in which this is not the kind of architecture people move through, right, in everyday life. It very distinctly is connected to pre-colonial Islamic rule. And I think that is important. So I guess as the medievalist here, you're picking up on that. The ways in which the architecture of the space is indexically tied up with pre-Islamic Muslim rule. And even in Bombay cinema, there's this constant nostalgia for the lost pre-colonial past. Really informs the way people move through the space. It's kind of like Benjamin talking about the Parisian arcades, but except you don't have spaces like this most of the time. You don't have access to architecture like this till you come to this space, which is in a sense much grander and much more open than the kinds of spaces in which people live, which are much more cramped and aesthetically not as nice. Yeah. Depends. It depends. It really does. Yeah. So, but yeah, it would be very different from most temple architecture. But again, that's I'm not going to. Yeah, it's a little iffy. Yeah.
So my question. Oh, that's weird. My question is, given what you were mentioning about the sort of rise of right-wing rhetoric in this area, like, how is it exactly that this space and these spaces have managed to sort of fly under the radar and continue to operate as they do?
That's a really good question, and I think I want to say that I think these operate because people have two kind of different registers in which they identify with religion, right? One is this idea of religion as ethical potentiality, which you see at a space like Feroz Shah Kotla, where it doesn't matter what your religious identity is. If you come into the space, you can act in certain ways and be a certain kind of person. And the other is the discourse of religion as what determines your identity. And because these things often coexist, they coexist in real life too. So you can have the same people who come to the site every Thursday. When it comes to vote, they will vote for the right-wing party, but that doesn't mean that when it's ambiguous, they will still come into the site and have these particular relations with people, at the shrine. I don't know how else to explain it.
So, while you were there, did you notice that the space itself, do you feel like that changed the way that people might have had those political conversations with each other?
Well, actually, what I said, because the kind of people who come here are, there's a lot of lower caste, there's a lot of women. These are not, the groups that come here, and there are huge exceptions to this, are not traditionally the people who would vote for the Hindu right-wing party. They're not necessarily upper caste Hindus, right? Even though there are several of them there as well, because the space doesn't distinguish. But yeah, the kind of clientele of this space is not necessarily the kind that would vote. But people who come to this space have participated in religious violence, right? They have been involved in things. They still will say sometimes angry things about Hindus or Muslims. But yet, so I don't know. I don't really have a satisfactory answer except that these things manage to coexist. So.
I guess my question is kind of just sort of tying together a lot of different questions that happened. He mentioned kind of like I guess, I don't know, kind of just what exactly ties the jinn to the site particularly? Because I know I'm in your class and we read about the site that had the king of the jinns and where people would present their these arguments to the king of the jinns, and then this is another site where they talk about the Baba is so I guess what ties those particular jinn to that site? Is it like a history or a personal thing? So
I mean, if you look at the literature on jinn, I mean, jinn are supposed to hang out in ruins and in habitations left behind by human beings. So there is that connection, and that connection here is long-standing. People didn't used to go to Feroz Shah Kotla because it was a ruin which was supposed to be inhabited by jinn, and you don't go to places which have jinn because they are terrifying. So I think one of the things that it was interesting for me is how at some point the space which is associated with jinn becomes a sacred space where you actually go to the Baba and have relations of intimacy. And of course, that's also tying into this other tradition we've talked about, the case of the animal versus man before the king of the jinn, going back to the 8th century or thereabouts, which Richard has translated, right, where the jinn are associated with justice, and they are associated with justice to animals and people who are marginal to, or animals and other creatures that are marginal to normative discourse, right? So there is that long link of jinns too, and also jinns being somehow terrifying and uncanny. So yeah.
So like, what's the culture like surrounding the shrines? Like, if someone goes here on a weekly basis, will they like advertise the fact that they go to their families, or is it like kind of like a secretive thing?
It's not secretive. It's which is why I think it's interesting that it's kind of the sanctioned space to it's a sanctioned space of transgressive desire, in a sense. Like, so going to the Dargah usually is not a transgressive. I mean, it's not considered, like, no one's going to stop you from going unless they're extremely, extremely right-wing, right? Like, then they'll have problems, and maybe not even then. So, yeah.
And then, sort of like a follow-up, like, if someone like said they were going to like the Dargah, like, what would be assumed about them? Like, is there kind of like an inner culture?
I don't know. I don't know. My guess is that that's just what people do. So it won't be a problem but I don't know enough to say more, right? Like, I never encountered anyone saying that going to the Dargah is strange or weird. Yeah, so, yeah.
Jay, you get the last question.
Okay, then let me follow up on this last train and tying what you're doing with the film Fire. It's one thing for people to talk, that's where I'm going, but you don't give details.
Yeah.
Now, on the one hand, if you write a scholarly book, your great wish is for it to be well known. But is there a concern that if in an objectified public forum, what goes on there is now made present, made known, will it then lead, are you afraid that, is there the possibility that now that this is in the public domain, these kinds of transgressive or anti-patriarchal or sorts of attitudes and values and behaviors may lead to them being clamped down?
Thank you for putting the fear of the right wing into me. And yeah, actually, it's a very valid question. One of the things that's happened because of my research is that Feroz Shah Kotla has kind of made its way on a little bit onto the tourist radar in Delhi, because suddenly English language publications are like, oh, there are jinns here. They didn't know about it before. And so far, it seems to not have substantially altered the character of the site, except there are more people there. I'm not sure. With this particular government, I don't trust them to not screw up anything and everything. So if I could get tenure without publishing a book, I might take that route, but I don't know. I don't know. I think it's a really good question, and I don't think I have a good answer to it. I'm hoping that it is so much a part of Indian culture, and it doesn't seem to affect people's political identities, so they'll just let it go. But I'm not, yeah, that's my hope, that it will just, because it doesn't affect voting patterns or anything of that sort, that it'll just fly under the radar. So, yeah.
Thank you. I encourage